New Mexico, 1883, a town forgotten by railroads and mercy, where even the sun seemed tired of rising. The dirt didn't just coat boots, it remembered them. Every footstep, every fall, every man who left, and every child who didn't. The air tasted like rusted iron and old tobacco, and in the middle of it, leaning against the crumbling chapel wall, sat a Navajo man who didn't blink when the wind howled. He was always there. Coat too big, boots too thin, back too straight for a man his age. He didn't beg. He didn't preach. He simply existed in silence so complete it made others restless. That morning, a new sound tried to fill the space he left open. A laugh, sharp, hollow, too loud for a place where even the horses walked quietly. A white drifter had arrived the night before, trailing whiskey and sarcasm like dust off his coat. Young, restless, the kind of man who looked for weak spots in others before they could find his. He stepped off the porch of the saloon with a swagger too practiced, his boots too clean for real work. When he saw the old man sitting by the chapel, something in him tightened, like shame wearing a smile. He spat a joke loud enough for everyone to hear, something about statues that don't even know they're dead. A few men in town looked up but said nothing. One woman turned away. No one laughed, but no one stopped him either. The Navajo man didn't move. He didn't flinch. His eyes stayed on the horizon, like they had seen things no man could ever unsee. His stillness wasn't weakness, it was weight. The drifter stood there longer than he meant to, waiting for a reaction, wanting a fight he didn't understand. But silence held its ground, and that was worse than any insult returned. That night, the wind changed. Not colder, but older. It carried something in it. Drumming, faint, soft. Not rhythm, not music, memory. The kind that hums through your bones when everything else goes quiet. The drifter rolled over in the cot behind the stable, clutching his coat tighter. He told himself it was just some Navajo chant carried on the wind, some ghost of ceremony long forgotten. But the sound didn't stop when he covered his ears. It was inside him now, steady, ancient, familiar. Sleep never came, and when the sun broke the edge of the hills, the town looked the same. But he didn't. Something in him had shifted. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible, but something no longer fit right beneath his skin. He found himself walking slower past the chapel, his gaze falling to the dirt instead of the man beside it. And though he told himself it meant nothing, deep down, he already knew. The silence had spoken back, and it had remembered his name. But the drifter didn't have a name he trusted anymore, just borrowed ones, left behind ones. He had worn so many stories that none of them fit, and when the silence whispered it knew him, it felt like a threat. So the next morning, he mocked louder. Not words this time, but posture, swagger, spit, the lazy way he leaned on the chapel gate, as if daring the old man to speak. But again nothing, just that gaze, not cold, not kind, just old, as if it had outlived disappointment itself. He scoffed, turned on his heel, but the echo of his own voice followed him down the street. That's the thing about mockery. It always sounds louder on the way back. Louder when no one laughs, louder when no one stops you, louder when the one you aimed it at doesn't even flinch. It had nowhere to land, so it followed him. That evening, he heard the townsfolk murmur behind doors cracked just enough for breath, not for light. Soft voices at dinner tables, forks scraping tin plates. They didn't speak of the insult. They didn't need to. They spoke of children taken, of a march that led nowhere, of boots in snow too deep for names to survive. They spoke of the old man's sons, of how he used to laugh once, before laughter became betrayal. But even in their whispering, no one said his name. Not out of respect, but because they had all failed him, and naming him would mean remembering, and remembering hurt. That night, the sky turned. Not rain, not mercy, sand, a wind that ripped across the valley like punishment with no voice. It came fast, thick, blinding, the kind of storm that makes doors groan and past knock. The drifter ducked into the stable, hands over his face, coughing grit. The horses paced, eyes wide with ancient fear. And he sat in the corner like a boy who had lied to a mother who already knew. His chest ached in ways he couldn't name. The drumming returned, but softer now, like a heartbeat beneath the dust. He curled into his coat, but there was no warmth, only a knowing. That whatever he had tried to laugh off now knew where he hid. And it wasn't coming to punish him. It was coming to remind him. The next morning the chapel stood untouched. Dust clung to its wooden cross like grief that refused to scatter, and beside it, as always, sat the old man. Same coat, same boots, same stillness. But this time, the drifter didn't look at him, because now he understood why the old man sat beside the chapel and never went inside. He wasn't waiting for God. He was waiting for an apology that would never come. The morning after the storm, the air hung still, too still, as if the desert itself held its breath. The drifter wandered without purpose, boots dragging through powder-dry soil, eyes fixed on things that refused to look back. His laughter had dried up like the creek beds around town. What filled the silence now was heavier, unspoken, unfaced. His steps took him where his mind didn't mean to go. Behind the chapel, past the bent fence into the old rectory long abandoned. No lock on the door, just absence. Dust hung in the air like memory that hadn't settled. The floor creaked, not with weight, but with history. He stepped through rooms stripped of names, until a shadow pulled him toward a corner where light leaked through a broken window and fell upon a book, a Bible, leather-bound, edges cracked, but not ruined. He opened it, half out of boredom, half out of that strange gravity grief carries. Inside, the words stared back at him. Not English, not Latin, Navajo, line after line of sacred verses rendered in a tongue he never learned, never should have known. But what struck him wasn't the language, it was the handwriting. His. At first he laughed, a dry, bitter thing, a trick of the light. Some stranger's scrawl mistaken for his own. But the loop of the R's, the shape of the T's, the way the ink sometimes thinned at the end of a sentence, like whoever wrote it paused, just like he did. It was him, or someone with his blood. He sat down hard on the wooden floor, book open across his lap, heart pacing like it had just remembered something it wanted to forget. And then, a flicker, childhood dreams, fragments, a woman's hands brushing his cheek before disappearing into firelight, horses running across dry plains with no sound, a drumbeat he had once called thunder, and his mother's voice, faint, just before she vanished. Don't forget who you are. He had, not by choice, but by survival. Those words had meant nothing at 10. They were just breath. Now they were fire. He looked again at the Bible, at the way each word had been placed with care, not translation, but transference. This wasn't a missionary's relic. This was a message, not for saving souls, but for remembering them. And suddenly the storm that had shaken the town felt small compared to the one rising inside him. Not of shame, not yet, but of recognition. He wasn't just looking at someone else's book. He was looking into his own story, one that had been waiting for him long before he ever arrived. From that day, something in his stride changed. His boots no longer beat the ground with the careless rhythm of a man trying to prove he belonged nowhere. Now each step felt watched, not by the town but by the pages he had left open on that wooden floor. Laughter no longer came easy, and when it did, it sounded like someone else's voice, borrowed and ill-fitting. He avoided the old man's gaze, not because he didn't want to meet it, but because he feared what it might confirm. Fear of being seen was different from fear of being caught. One could be escaped, the other lived in you. When he did walk past the chapel, the Bible weighed on him like an unspoken confession. The words inside were not just ink, they were a mirror, and mirrors are merciless. One afternoon, he carried the Bible to where the old man sat. The sun was lowering, sharpening the edges of the shadows across the street. He stood there, book in hand, unsure of the shape of his own intent. When he finally offered it, the old man looked not at the cover, but at the drifter's fingers holding it. His eyes didn't question. They didn't forgive. They simply saw. Then, with a slow breath, the old man shook his head, pushing the book gently back toward him, and nodded toward the chapel door. The drifter swallowed. His throat felt raw, like he'd been shouting all night without a sound. He wanted to ask why. Why not take it? Why leave it with him? But the question stayed trapped. A mouth can hold words, but the heart will decide if they're allowed out. He turned away, clutching the book tighter, feeling its edges cut into his palms. That night the drumming returned, louder now, but it was not outside. It was in the space between his heartbeat and his breath, and with every thud, one thought pressed harder against him. He wasn't ready to know what that book meant. Not the language, not the scripture, but the history it carried in silence, the kind of history that doesn't just tell you where you're from, but demands you live differently once you know. It was the widow, who broke the quiet first. She lived in a small house near the edge of town, where the wind carried the smell of sagebrush through the cracked boards of her porch. She had eyes that seemed older than her body, like they'd learned to hold sorrow without spilling it. One late afternoon, she called to him as he passed, her voice soft but certain, like someone addressing a stray animal they didn't expect to keep. Inside, her home was lined with things that didn't match. A chipped cup beside a fine china plate, a single boot on the shelf next to a folded quilt. She poured him coffee without asking, her hands steady in a way his never were. And then she spoke, not of him, but of the old man by the chapel. He buried 2 sons, she said, stirring sugar into her cup, though she never drank it that way. No one came to pray with him, not even the preacher. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. She rose from her chair and crossed to a cedar chest against the far wall. When she returned, she carried a quilt, worn thin in places, patched in others. She unfolded it across the table, revealing its strange geometry, squares cut from old military uniforms, stitched beside fragments of treaty papers yellowed with age, and in one corner, a child's drawing of a horse sewn into the fabric like a secret. Her voice dropped lower. "Women remember what men try to drink away," she said, not accusing, not pitying, just stating it as the weather. Her gaze lingered on him a moment longer than was comfortable. And in that gaze, he felt the weight of things he hadn't lived but somehow carried, the kind of burdens passed down through blood, without consent. When he left her house, the sun had dipped behind the hills, and the wind was picking up again. The coffee's bitterness still clung to his tongue. In his hands he carried nothing, but in his chest there was something heavier than the Bible, something he couldn't yet name, but knew he could no longer set down. That night, the air had a strange stillness to it, the kind that holds a town's breath before something breaks. The moon was only a sliver, sharp as a blade, casting long shadows across the chapel walls. He was lying in the stable loft when the smell reached him, smoke not from a hearth but from something burning where it shouldn't. He ran into the street, boots striking hard against the dirt, and saw the fire licking up the side of the chapel. It wasn't rage that had started it. It was despair. A young boy, no more than 16, stood nearby, his face streaked with soot and tears. He wasn't looking at the flames. He was looking at the ground, as if ashamed of what his own hands had done. The drifter didn't ask why. He already knew. Sometimes a man sets fire not to destroy a building, but to erase the reflection staring back at him in its windows. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. The old Navajo man was walking straight into the firelight. Not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with the calm of someone who understood that what burns in wood is nothing compared to what burns in memory. The drifter shouted, but the old man didn't turn. Without thinking, he followed. Heat closed around him, searing the edges of his coat, stealing his breath. He pushed through the doorway, coughing, eyes searching through the orange haze. The old man was near the front, standing at the altar. In his hands was the Bible. The same one. The same handwriting. The elder didn't run for the exit. He turned toward the window, hurled the book through it with a force that seemed impossible for his thin frame. The leather hit the dirt outside, rolling away from the flames. Safe. Untouched. The drifter lunged forward, grabbing the old man's arm, pulling him toward the door as beams above them groaned. They stumbled out into the cold night, coughing, gasping, the fire raging behind them, but unable to touch the book lying in the dust. It sat there between them, illuminated by firelight but untouched by ash, a small stubborn survivor in a world that wanted forgetting to be easy. Neither man reached for it. Not yet. They just stood, breathing hard, as the chapel burned and the wind began to shift. When the fire was nothing more than a low glow behind them, the drifter stepped toward the book. The leather was warm under his palm, carrying the heat of the night and something older, like it had been waiting for his touch. He opened it again, not to the beginning but to the back. The final page was nearly empty except for a single phrase written over and over in the same deliberate hand. "I remember." The words repeated like the echo of a bell, the ink growing lighter, as if whoever wrote them had kept going until their strength gave out. He stared at the last line for a long time, feeling the shape of the letters in his own muscles, in the memory of his own handwriting. Then, without knowing why, he pulled a pencil from his coat pocket and wrote his name next to it. The lead broke halfway through, but he didn't stop. The page didn't just hold the words now, it held the weight of his admission. He closed the book and looked up. The old man stood a few feet away, eyes fixed on him, unreadable. No nod, no smile, just the steady presence of someone who had been waiting for this without expecting it. The drifter understood then. It wasn't coincidence. The same loops, the same lines, the same hesitations in the letters. This was his handwriting because it was his blood. By morning, the town was talking. Some said the drifter had left, riding west before the smoke even cleared. Others swore they'd seen him kneeling in the dust beside the old man, neither speaking, both looking at something far beyond the horizon. The truth wasn't theirs to tell. Weeks later, those who paid attention noticed a change. The old man's coat, the one too big for him, frayed at the cuffs, was now worn by the drifter. It hung heavy on his shoulders, the sleeves still too long, but he didn't wear it for warmth or to look like the elder. He wore it to carry the same weight, the kind of weight that can't be put down once you finally know it's yours. The chapel still stood, though one side was blackened like a scar that refused to fade. The roof sagged in places, but the bell above the door remained silent yet unbroken. People passed by more quietly now, as if the fire had burned away not just wood, but the comfort of pretending they didn't see. The Bible rested on a small table just inside the door. No lock, no glass. Anyone could pick it up, turn the pages, trace the ink with their fingers, but most didn't. A few lingered at the threshold, glancing in as though afraid that reading it might change something they weren't ready to face. Dust gathered on its cover in slow, deliberate layers, as if even the wind respected its patience. The old Navajo man was no longer there in the mornings. Some claimed they saw him leave at dawn, walking toward the hills without looking back. Others whispered that he had been gone for years, and what they'd seen was only memory dressed in skin. In this town, both versions were possible. The drifter spoke little now. His voice, once loud enough to fill the saloon, had grown quiet, as though every word had to be weighed before it was given away. Once a week at night, he lit a fire outside the chapel, small, contained. A flame meant not for heat, but for keeping something alive. He would sit beside it until the embers glowed low, his hands resting on his knees, the old coat draped around him like a second skin. There was no sermon, no confession, no final act of redemption that could be named. Only the slow rhythm of boots on dry earth when he finally rose and walked away. Footsteps that the dust, faithful as ever, would remember.